Hey, Nick, welcome to the Virtual CMO podcast. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. I'm talking to you, Eric. How could I not be fantastic?
Hey, I love it. I love it. I feel a little competitive today because you've got such a great voice for this. And I know you've got some experience in broadcasting. Tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you use that voice.
Oh boy, I'll try and keep this short. So I grew up in Montreal, and I knew two things as a kid. One, I wanted to work in radio, and the other was I hated winter. I really remember. I remember that as an 8 or 9 year old, and so I went to broadcast school in Canada, and I worked in radio and TV for about 5 years in Toronto. And then someone said to me, they're like, "Hey, can you do that radio thing from a stage?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I can." And that began a 20-year career in the cruise industry, where I would get on stage and pitch all kinds of products in the duty-free sector. So it was interesting. It was still about broadcast and radio and TV, but it kind of developed into a sales role, which is something I never expected. I thought I'd be doing play-by-play for the Montreal Expos, but a lot of issues there.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. And good thing you're not in the cruise industry right now.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's actually a great industry, and I'll always be a cruise ship guy. So I'm not sure how everything will resolve itself, but I know they'll come back better and stronger, and I'm excited for that. I have a lot of friends and family still in the business, so positive vibes for them.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of people who really enjoy that, and I think there's a lot of pent up demand. And I think once they start sailing again, they'll see that industry come back. I'm from Orlando, which is obviously a very tourist town, and
Yep.
we've certainly seen a huge decline in the number of people that are here. But I think there's also an incredible amount of demand that's building up. We're just in a crazy time for sure. So the focus of today is on your business, which is sales pitching, and this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. Spent many years working with various salespeople, and in my role as a virtual CMO, helping companies developing out their messaging. When you sort of start to engage with people, what do you see as some of the top problems that people have with their sales pitch?
So I think when I look at someone's sales pitch, whether it's a solopreneur or a company with hundreds of employees, there's always a few things that right off the bat jump out at me. And typically is how is the presentation structured? How does the deck look? How does the deck tie into what the messaging is? And then really the most important thing is, what's the story you're telling? And I think sometimes, I'll talk to a business owner who's maybe in IT or software as a service, for example, and they're like, well, what's the story about a software as a service? But when you dig down and find those and then really kind of package that in a beautiful way, I think that's really the opportunity that a lot of people miss with their sales presentations.
I love that because a story is so important. And it seems like what most people miss oftentimes is it's not necessarily about features and functions and bullet points. It's really about an emotional connection and building trust. You see that as well when you talk to people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you actually get into the presentation, this is one of the best tips that I think that I help people. How do you build rapport quickly? And, this is 20 years of me on a gangway on embarkation day in Miami saying, welcome aboard, where are you from? And it was really interesting because I think people miss the opportunity to build rapport. And I think if you have your LinkedIn browser constantly open and, oh, I'm about to talk to Eric, let me just profile and see what, maybe we might have in common. And that's an opportunity that is missed. People just dive right into it because they're excited to have, a prospect, and they're excited to tell their story and what they have. But taking a few minutes to really understand where someone's from. And I think the reason that became such a important piece of what I do, Eric, is when I was training people in the cruise industry, they weren't Americans working on the ship. There was maybe 1 in 1,000. There was almost no Canadians. I was teaching people from Serbia and South Africa and Colombia how to connect specifically with Americans. And one thing I learned very quickly is that after their loved ones and themselves, what Americans really like to talk about is where they're from, right? It's very tribal. I'm wearing my colors. I'm wearing my, University of South Florida, not my Florida State Seminoles. So when you start to ask people where they're from, and you can kind of build your own database of, oh, Orlando, well, we could talk about this, or I was in Orlando and I had the best thing I've ever eaten at this restaurant. it really gives you an opportunity to quickly build rapport way faster than you think. And this is especially true, I think, as we live in this Zoom world where, we are dealing with people from all across the country.
So when we first met, one of the things that I noticed immediately about you was how you employ these techniques just in casual conversation. So you use my name a lot in conversation. And I think a lot of people are afraid to do that, to start using somebody's name right away. There's that problem that we have where when we're making an introduction to someone, we're so concerned about what we're going to say that we're not really doing a good job of active listening and understanding who the person is. And so a minute later, you can't remember who it was that you were just introduced to. So you've obviously made a very conscious effort to sort of include something simple like someone's name often in your conversation as a way to build rapport. That's an active tactic that you've worked on over the years?
So I think a lot of the things that I actually used today, it wasn't intentional and it wasn't necessarily active tactics. It was, again, just being kind of this cruise ship guy and having 4,000 people every week that I'd have to go out and get to know to get them to maybe want to buy something from me. And, especially if, and I'll give a shout out here to Holland America Cruise Lines, or Holland America Line, which is a fantastic cruise line. And their guests are the same guests over and over. So if I see Mrs. Smith from Des Moines, good chance in 6 months to see her on another Holland America Line ship. So, for me, it's if you want to translate that to business, I don't want to just do business with Eric today. I want to do business with Eric for 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? So for me, it's about building those genuine relationships. And for me personally, it's how I'm wired, but there's ways I think that I've really tried to kind of break down the technique or things that I just kind of do, and maybe don't realize I do, and then structure that to help people when they're engaging people, again, especially in this kind of 30-minute Zoom world that we live in now.
But it is easier to remember somebody's name if it's Eric from Orlando versus Eric or Nick from a mountain in Arizona, right? When you learn those things about people, you can start to build that connection and build that rapport.
Well, for me, it's the genuine interest of I want to get to know Eric, and I really want to, I understand what you're interested in, because again, it's something that I use now every day in sales and presentations. But at the time, it was I'm going to see Eric every day for the next 7 days. So I got to be out, chatting and chit chatting with people, so it's perfect. But I think it became something, using someone's name, it just became a polite respect thing for me. But there's no doubt that it keeps the person I'm talking to more engaged. And this number 8 that's always in my head, if I'm having a 30-minute conversation with you, Eric, I'm going to try to say your name times. Just like anything else I'd want you to remember. I really want you to remember a key phrase in my presentation. You're going to hear that from me 8 times. Might be worded slightly different every time, but I'll make sure that you hear it 8 times.
That's great. And I'd love to dig into your process a little bit more. So when a company engages with you to help build out a sales pitch, and you start to look at some of their existing materials and see what they're doing, what's your typical process when you first walk in the door and start to engage with a new client?
Well, the first thing I always want to actually look at the physical presentation. So what's the script you're working off of? What's the slide deck you're working off of? And there's really 2 parts to what I do. One is what's the physical presentation, and then you get your sales team to deliver it. And when I come into, let's say I'm working with a solopreneur or someone who's got maybe 10 employees or less, they oftentimes are the operator or the technical luminary company, but by default become the de facto head of business development, which they're often miscast. So how do I take someone who's out there selling their business because no one else as well as them, but they're really shaped correctly to do it? So take it into their words, how they speak. So I'll spend time with them. And this is one thing that I teach people all the time. When I'm writing any kind of copy or any kind of presentation, I always write it to be spoken, whereas I find most of the world writes it to be read. So I'm going to speak differently if it's a text that is going to be spoken. So how I'll often do that is I'll actually go out and record my thoughts on the product and then kind of take that together into a script. So, but to answer your question properly, Eric, yeah, definitely looking at what the script is. And then once that is either been rebuilt or not oftentimes, but there are occasions where I come in, I'm like, that's pretty much perfect. Maybe some slight verbiage changes. But then when you take that and give it to your salespeople, how are they presenting it? What pace are they speaking? Because there's oftentimes you got a lot of you got to get through. So you want to get through that part really quickly. But when something's really important, where do you pause? How do you build up to a reveal? Right. So those are the real two key components of how I involve myself with companies when I'm their sales presentation and getting the team to actually go ahead and deliver it.
I think that's really interesting. As a podcast host, oftentimes guests will send me an introduction to read, that just gives a short bio of their history. And I find myself when I read these things, struggling sometimes because they don't roll off the tongue. There's a lot of information that they cram into a couple sentences, but it doesn't roll off the tongue very easily. And so I find I'm rewriting a lot of them because you just want to say it in a way that's more familiar, more casual, more easy to understand. So I think that's a very interesting point that you're bringing up about sort of speaking it first and then writing it down second.
Well, I'll take it even a step further. I actually posted a piece of content on my LinkedIn today about crutch words. And, a lot of times, how can everything be amazing or life-changing or disruptive, right? It can't. So what I was actually, suggesting people do today is take one of your 30-minute Zoom conversations, click play in your web browser, and then open up a Word document and click dictate. And it is a very uncomfortable experience to actually go through and realize, how many times you said amazing or it's incredible. And when you go through and kind of change that, it allows you to be more engaging. And at the end of the day, there is nothing more important than engagement when you're presenting anything. Another thing that I think is really important when I'm coaching people, they're so afraid of missing the key word or key phrasing that's worked for them before. So keep talking and make sure they get everything out. And, when I told Eric that time, I definitely said this. I'm going to say that. And so what I try to get people to do, and let's just for the sake of this conversation, kind of talk about it in a 30 minutes, is want to do is lay out your key points, and you really want to hammer those points home, deliver them. But after you've kind of spent 2-3 minutes building rapport, again, in a 30-minute window, you really want to only have about 7 minutes of talking about what you have. And what you want to do is lay the breadcrumbs for them to ask questions back to you.
So I think if we go back to one of the things that you said earlier, a lot of times the principle of a business, the founder is typically kind of technical. They're in the weeds. They love their product. They are enamored with all the things that it does. And they can get very in the weeds, right? In terms of talking about all the great things that it does, the amazing things that it does. So how do you pull those people back and say, you got to ease off that, and you've got to build this into more of a story that's of interest to your audience?
How do you edit yourself? What it comes down to. And the hardest thing for anyone to do, and I'm a guy who's not afraid of being in front of camera or getting out and just talking, but even for me, the hardest thing for me to do is sit down and watch a recording of me going and speaking, right? It's really difficult. And I think the opportunity that's missed, if you just wanted to self-correct quickly, if I never had a conversation with you, Eric, and you said, Nick, give me one piece of advice, I'd say, watch your meetings and just look for patterns, positive or negative. Right. And I think something else that's really interesting, again, getting into especially founders, let's say you've had your business for 5 years. Well, in the first 2-3 weeks, when everything was exciting, it's like a new relationship. You may have come up with what you see as your tagline that you're still using today. Well, the reality is your business has evolved over those 60 months and is nowhere near like it was at the beginning, but you're still using that and it becomes a crutch, right? So the first thing I always ask people is, I'll literally pull up a timer and I'll say, okay, you got 45 seconds. Tell me what you do. 1 out of 50 will nail it. And it's not that there's a right or wrong way to do it. It's that I think people oftentimes don't know how to express exactly what it is they do. And if you take a little bit of time and kind of massage, what the key phrasing is, you can really increase the likelihood that someone is going to have a light bulb moment and say, oh, that makes sense to me. Okay, that's interesting. Now I want to have a conversation with you.
So do you like them to frame it in terms of how they're solving a particular problem?
It really see, and that's a rabbit hole we could go down. That's a whole other conversation because it really depends on the product, right? So selling software as a service is going to be a 180 from pet food, right? As an example. So it really depends on, kind of pulling out that story. And a lot of people talk about storytelling, and it's very relevant. But how do you tell a story and sell that story at the same time? And that's where you really have to look at what the business is. I worked with this great manufacturing company here in Phoenix. And, when I first started working with them, they kept telling me, we're a manufacturing company. We're a manufacturing company. And when I dug in a bit more, I understood that one of the co-founders was actually an engineer, and that all the competitors engineered their products offshore, and everyone tested their products offshore, and everyone project managed offshore. Not this company. They did everything here in Arizona. And so I said, well, you're not really a manufacturing firm, because that just kind of clumps you in with everyone else that's doing the same thing, that's offshoring everything. You're an engineering and manufacturing firm that focuses on developing products here in America and tests everything here in America. And then when you have a project management issue, when we've done a great job of engineering and manufacturing something for you, and now we're actually on site installing, and you have an issue, you've got Lindsay on the phone or Mike on the phone here in Phoenix. You're not dealing with someone overseas. So how do you take something that's about manufacturing and kind of, shape it? Well, really, it was just kind of digging into the story. Now it's something that they knew, but no one had shone the light on it that way before for them.
I think that's an interesting point, because many businesses will default to saying that their unique differentiator is its price. It's that our widget is 10 times better than somebody else's widget, or it comes in more colors, or, we can ship it to you a day faster. But oftentimes their biggest differentiators are things, just like you said, that maybe it's made here in the USA. Maybe they've got a reputation for just outstanding customer service, or, they can restock your shelves overnight or something like that. But many times they default to things that truly aren't differentiators that any one of their competitors could say as well.
And I think it's just, we live in this kind of techno-babble world where everyone's like, well, what are they doing? Let's do the same thing. And there's not a lot of innovation and creativity, right? And people talk to me and they say, Nick, you're in sales. I actually consider myself a creative marketer, right? I'm a creative person. That's what I am. I grew up in Montreal. It's a French city. We grew up with architecture and art. When I tell people that, they're like, what? What are you talking about? So for me, it's about crafting something. It's artisanal. And I think when you have that kind of perspective, you can take something that's a SaaS, or you can take something that's about manufacturing and still apply those same ideas about creating something that's artistic and creative. And really, at the end of the day, that's what people want. That's why we watch television or watch movies or whatever it is to be entertained. It's the same thing. And I think, rapport is really important when it comes to presentation. The other thing that people miss is setting the tone, right? Whenever I get on a call with someone, I'm like, hi, how are you? And it catches people off guard because they're not expecting that. But what I've just done is, one, they like me a lot more now, because people, buy from people they like. We know that. That's well established. But people like being around people who like them, right? So I'm excited to talk to you, Eric, because I'm a people person. So, Eric, how are you? That changes the whole dynamic of the next 29 and a half minutes of what we're going to talk about. And I think when I talk about bringing energy up and really engaging people, people think that they have to keep that energy through the whole conversation. Well, that doesn't really work. But what you want to have you want it to be an arrow in your quiver. So when you need it, when you need to break out a little bit more boost, you can do that. And I think, I talk to people and they're like, yeah, but Nick, I'm on Zoom meetings all day. Well, the reality is that when you go home, you can get takeout because you're too tired to cook. But if you want to be really good at sales and really kind of crush your targets, you got to bring energy and get people enthusiastic and excited about what you're talking about. Because otherwise, they're doing other things. They're multitasking. We might be on a Zoom, but I've got other browsers going on and I'm replying to an email. If I've got you engaged and I've got you excited, more likely I'm going to keep your undivided attention for that period of time.
When I went to your website, one of the first things.
It's not a very good website,
Well,
Eric.
that's okay. But one of the first things that you do is you have a YouTube video up there. And I think the first thing that you say in that video is, hi, can I get you a cup of coffee or some water? And, that is a little bit disarming, because that's not how people typically open a video on the web, obviously, because you can't get me a cup of coffee or water. But it immediately did build a little rapport. It showed sort of an informal casualness that made the rest of what you were going to have to say be a little bit more in context. And so, you've talked about Zoom meetings a number of times, and we've gone from a world where salespeople oftentimes could get in front of their customers, where they could build that rapport, where they could read the room, read the body language. That's all a lot tougher in this world of virtual meetings. So what are some other things that you would suggest to people in terms of building the rapport, reading the room, understanding how to get that engagement from a virtual audience?
So that's a great question. And I'm also going to preface it by saying, Eric, that this is the future. I think at some point we'll go back to hopping into airplanes, but I think a lot of people realize that if you can master this right now, this will set you apart from your competitors. One of the things I think that also is really important is, how you're reading people's body language. And I have an unfair advantage because some of the stuff is so subconscious, it's difficult for me to pull it out and teach it. And the reason is people talk about 10,000 hours. I have about 20,000 hours of live presenting to about 500 people at a time. So how I've absorbed body language is something that in how I deliver anything that I do has been kind of built to appeal to everybody. So that's one thing that people are kind of caught off guard with is, I'll connect with someone from New York, someone from California, someone from Iowa, someone from Texas, right? It's really a broad thing. And I think reading body language and understanding, do I have this person engaged, is the most important thing you can do. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, building rapport. Oh, you're from St. Louis? How does the whole world not know about toasted raviolis from Mom on the Hill? It's the greatest thing I've ever eaten. It is one of the greatest things I've ever eaten. And every time I talk to someone from St. Louis, I go right to toasted ravioli or Provel cheese. And Eric, I'm telling you, go Google Provel cheese. I don't know how this is not distributed across the country. But that building rapport now, again, I don't like the word disarm, but I understand disarms you, right? So now I see your body language is more relaxed. I've got you engaged. How do I maintain that throughout? Because again, this is the future. This is, we're living in it now. So how we adapt to this is going to really separate, the wheat from the chaff.
And as a salesperson, there are many different ways that you connect with people. Obviously, there's the marketing message on the website, maybe some video content there. There's emails. There's ultimately your presentation, whether that's a PowerPoint or a keynote. What are some things that people can do just to make their content more engaging? Maybe start out with sales email. What do you think people do right and wrong when it comes to writing a sales email, whether it's a follow-up from a meeting or sort of a cold email outreach?
I think it's lack of personalization. I think so specifically with emails, it's a lot of, we live in a copy and paste world. Whereas again, I'm going to pull out every single piece from the conversation that you and I have discussed, and I'm going to put that back in to show you that I was also engaged and that I'm interested in having another conversation with you. And I think when we talk about presentations, people sometimes get lost and they're like, okay, so Nick, you're going to help me with my 30-minute presentation. It's really about having that first conversation, which opens up the next conversation. So one of my favorite things to do, and people love this, is I'll go to loom.com. I pay $10 a month. And what I'll do is I'll just click record and I will customize a thank you. Takes me 45 seconds. I copy and paste it into the email, and I'll say something along the lines of, hey, this isn't a generic video. I just wanted to truly thank you, Eric, for the time that we spent today. And then when people say that, they're like, holy smokes, who is this person that I'm talking to? They took the time to make a customized video to talk to me, right? It really changes the game. So again, if you're sending out a stock email or even in your marketing, right? In your marketing drip, it's so stock. And again, it's very boxy, right? But if I customize it, that person not only wants to talk to me, they're the one asking for my calendar to book the next meeting.
I previously worked with a company called Get Accept. It's like a DocuSign competitor,
Okay.
and one of their key selling features was the ability to embed those videos in contracts or present or proposals that were sent over. And it was a little ad. You know, you could do that manually if you wanted, but it was a nice little addition to the workflow, because here you are ultimately asking for the business, ultimately presenting a proposal, but you could do it in a video. You could do it in a much more personalized way rather than just a copy and paste email, like you said. And I'm amazed how few people actually embed videos in their emails. I've had a few, you know, who have done the old, they hold up a cue card and they say, you know, hello, Eric, or something like that to get you actually to click and play the video. But it works almost every time because you know that there is some personalized content there. So I think that's great. Do you find that sometimes when people put together a presentation, they want to be too much like Steve Jobs? They want to do something that's too over the top and fancy for what their skill level is?
Hi, Eric.
There you go. Perfect. I love it.
So that's a really interesting question. I think let's talk about Steve, talk about live presentation. So let's talk about, I'm not having a one-on-one with you. Now I'm in front of maybe 50 people who are at my webinar, right? Versus maybe 200 people who are at a live session and maybe a conference before. I think everything that I've talked about not only applies, but is amplified in this situation, right? I want to build engagement. So what I would do when I was on a cruise ship, I'd have a microphone in my hand, I'd be in the theater and there'd be 500 people there. So what I would do is what I would call pre-talk. So for 15 minutes, I would walk through the crowd. I mean, literally up and down the stairs. Hi, how are you? Where are you visiting from? And engaging people in conversations, because one, it was more interesting than just sitting there listening to music playing, right? Or some sort of presentation. But now subconsciously they realized I like this guy, and subconsciously they've committed to buying something from me. Now, is it going to be a bag of coffee from Jamaica, or is it going to be, you know, a Swiss watch in Grand Cayman? I don't know yet, but they've decided that they like me. And I think that the exact same thing applies if you're in front of a group. What's more important than your messaging about what you're selling is your messaging about you as the individual. And how do I get people on Team Nick as quickly as possible? And I think people who really succeed at this, and it's a lot of salespeople because they're in sales because they're personable. But the more personable you are, the more that people are going to look at you and say, okay, wow, this is interesting. I'm going to give more attention. I'm not going to be on my phone through this presentation. It's less about, here's my sales point 1, 2, 3. It's about, hey, what are we all doing after this? Oh, you know what? Should we have a virtual happy hour? Did everyone bring their glass to cheers? Whatever it is, whatever works for you. But I guess, you know, the best way to say it, be playful, be a little bit playful. And if that goes against how you're wired, then maybe it shouldn't be you doing the presentation. Maybe it should be someone in your team who can build that kind of rapport and have a little bit of that playfulness to first engage and then maintain the engagement.
I love that because, you know, having attended many conferences and even watching things like a Saturday Night Live, you see how audiences respond to people. If it's somebody that they know, like let's just use the Saturday Night Live example. If it's a character that they know, almost without them doing anything, they will laugh. They look, I think there's a relationship with the past work that makes them feel comfortable with the character, and they just immediately accept it. Whereas maybe a guest host who is on, who may be a very funny person, they don't quite know the character that they're trying to present, and so they kind of have to warm up to it a little bit. And okay, I think
I'm taking that, stealing that. I'm taking that and I'm stealing that. That's great. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot on the air lately about you know, the presidential election and whatnot, and Jim Carrey has been playing Biden on there, and people have had to warm up to that. Whereas Alec Baldwin has been playing Trump, and they know that character; it's been on for a while, and they immediately laugh at whatever he says. And so I see this with speakers as well, or salespeople when they present, is maybe they come out too fast and furious, trying to be funny or tell jokes, instead of really showing something about themselves, really letting the audience understand who they are, warm up to them before they sort of go right for the punchline.
Absolutely. And that, you know, I think too, I've said it, but I'll say it again. I think picking the right person in your organization to be the face of your organization, to be the mouthpiece of your organization is really important. And this is going to, this applies to someone who's got 10 employees or 1,000 employees. Who is the face of your organization? And there's been times where, I've run into owners and they've got an amazing personality, just oodles of personality. I'm like, oh, you're the face. And they're like, oh, I don't want to be. And I'm like, but this is what we need to talk about. We need to talk about you, because I'm not even thinking about how beautiful the jewelry is that you make, or how fantastic this IT service is. You are so interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I can get people who have that and really bring it out of them, it changes the whole dynamic it changes the trajectory of their company. And I think, we're talking about video. I just had a conversation before we got on today, Eric, and this gentleman is like, look, I understand that you're telling me I should be putting content out there and I should, be engaging with people, but I'm so uncomfortable. I'm so uncomfortable. Okay. Even with all the hours I have, it still makes me uncomfortable to put something out to my network of people who are going to say, oh, wow, there's Nick again. But the reality is that there is no better lead generation tool, at least in my experience, than being able to kind of have some pre-engagement with people and get them interested in what you're talking about. So I think that's, look, the reality is if someone has built a business, they're a visionary and they're driven, and usually they're very, I'll say, focused, right? So a lot of times they're like, well, no, it's me. It has to be me. But if you can just look at it from a different perspective and shine a light on someone else who might be a better fit, there's a real opportunity there for you to get more traction, build more leads, close more sales.
Nick, this is a fascinating topic. I think we could talk about it for hours. And as a marketing person who works very hard with companies to help them get sales-ready leads, I absolutely am in favor of salespeople being able to have a better pitch and close those leads. So I think you provide a service that is needed out in the marketplace very badly. Tell people where they can find you on the web.
So again, I have a terrible website. It's salespitching.com. But if you want to book a meeting with me, have a 15-minute conversation, it's a great place to do it. Or I'd love for you, if you're listening, connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just look up my name, NickCapozzi. And please connect with me. Even if we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'd love to virtual you.
Nick, that's great. I really appreciate you spending some time with me and the audience today, sharing these tips. And if you are looking to redefine your sales process and put a better sales pitch in front of your potential clients, definitely look up Nick on the web. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me. It's very gentlemanly of you.
Absolutely.